July 23rd, 1944. Morning mist still clung to the hedgerows of Normandy when Oberleutnant Hans Becker heard the sound that had come to dominate his existence. Not the rumble of approaching tanks or the crack of anti-tank guns, but something higher pitched, more distant, a sound that made every man in his Panther tank crew freeze. The whine of aircraft engines. Becker ordered his driver to halt immediately. The massive Panther, all 45 tons of the most advanced tank Germany had fielded, rolled to a stop beneath the thickest tree cover Becker could find. Through his commander's cupola, he scanned the sky. There, two dark shapes, growing larger, thunderbolts, American P-47s, the aircraft his men had nicknamed Jabos, short for Jagbomber, fighter bombers. The planes weren't hunting for him, specifically. They were hunting for anything German that moved. Becker's crew sat in absolute silence as the fighters passed overhead, their Pratt and Whitney engines creating a sound that was now more terrifying to German tankers than any ground threat they faced. This wasn't what Becker had trained for. He had spent 2 years learning tank warfare, studying the tactics that had made the Panzerwaffe the most feared armored force in the world. He knew how to engage enemy tanks, how to maneuver for position, how to use terrain and surprise. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. An enemy that attacked from above with such overwhelming superiority that movement itself had become suicidal. The question that would haunt German tank commanders for the remainder of the war hung in the morning air above that hedgerow. How do you fight a war of maneuver when the sky belongs entirely to your enemy? When every road becomes a killing zone? When concealment is your only defense? When the most powerful tank in your arsenal is helpless against an aircraft that costs a fraction of what your tank does to build? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The answer German panzer commanders discovered in Normandy would reshape their understanding of armored warfare forever, not through gradual realization, but through brutal, immediate, undeniable evidence written in burning tanks scattered across the Norman countryside. To understand what happened to the Panzerwaffe in France in the summer of 1944, you need to understand what German tank commanders believed when they arrived. That belief was built on 5 years of experience that had made them the most successful armored force in military history. September 1939. Poland fell in 27 days. May 1940. France collapsed in 6 weeks. April 1941. Yugoslavia surrendered in 11 days. The pattern was consistent. German panzer divisions, concentrated at decisive points, achieved breakthrough, then exploited deep into enemy rear areas, creating encirclements and forcing surrenders before defenders could react. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it had worked against every opponent Germany had faced in Europe. The doctrine was built on specific principles: concentrate armor for breakthrough, maintain speed and momentum, bypass resistance rather than fight for every position, keep moving faster than the enemy can respond. Above all, never give the enemy time to establish coherent defenses. By 1944, the Panzerwaffe had refined these principles through years of combat on the Eastern Front. Tank commanders knew how to exploit gaps in enemy lines. They understood combined arms coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support. They had developed sophisticated tactical techniques for engaging enemy armor. And they had the machines. The Panther tank that Oberleutnant Becker commanded in July 1944 was arguably the best medium tank of the war. Its 75mm gun could penetrate any Allied tank at combat ranges. Its sloped armor was nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons from the front. It had excellent optics, a powerful engine, and sophisticated fire control. The Tiger tank was even more formidable. 88mm gun, armor that could withstand most Allied tank rounds, and a reputation that preceded it. Allied tank crews had learned to fear Tigers. German tank commanders knew this and used it. When German panzer divisions began moving toward Normandy after the Allied invasion on June 6, 1944, Their commanders expected to apply the operational principles that had worked for 5 years. The Allies had established a beachhead. Very well. German armor would concentrate, break through the thin Allied lines, drive to the coast, split the invasion forces, and destroy them piecemeal. It was the standard solution. It had worked in Poland, in France, in the opening months of the Russian campaign. There was no reason to think it wouldn't work again. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, approved plans for immediate counterattacks. Multiple Panzer divisions would converge on the invasion beaches. Speed was essential. The Allies were weakest immediately after landing, before they could bring their full strength ashore. But the Panzer divisions didn't converge quickly. They didn't converge at all for days. And when they finally reached the front, they arrived in fragments, exhausted, having lost significant portions of their strength, not to enemy ground forces, but to something else entirely. 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, began moving toward Normandy from southern France on June 8th. The division had over 200 tanks and assault guns, 15,000 men, hundreds of vehicles. It should have been able to cover the 450 miles to Normandy in 3 to 4 days, arriving in time to participate. In the immediate counteroffensive, the division took 17 days to reach the front. When it arrived, it had lost approximately 1/3 of its armor and vehicles, not to combat, to air attack. Every movement during daylight hours brought immediate response from Allied fighter bombers. Tank columns on roads were strafed and rocketed, convoys were scattered, bridges were destroyed, railway movements were interdicted. The division's commander, SS Brigadeführer Heinz Lammerding, later reported that his unit had been under almost constant air attack during the entire movement. Similar reports came from every Panzer division moving toward Normandy. 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, positioned closer to the invasion beaches, took 3 days to move 60 miles. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite armored formations in the German army, lost over 200 vehicles and 5,000 men during its approach march before ever reaching the front lines. The Luftwaffe was supposed to provide air cover. German doctrine had always assumed at least air parity, the ability to contest control of the airspace above ground operations. In Poland, France, and the early Russian campaigns, German ground forces had operated under friendly skies. Luftwaffe fighters cleared the air. Stuka dive bombers provided close air support. The sky was an ally. In Normandy, the sky was an enemy. The Luftwaffe could barely get aircraft into the battle area. Allied air superiority was so complete that German fighters were outnumbered 10 or 15 to 1 in any engagement. Most didn't even try. Luftwaffe units conserved their strength, waiting for conditions that never materialized. This left German ground forces completely exposed. No air cover meant Allied fighters and fighter bombers operated with near impunity. They orbited over the battlefield in relays, ensuring constant coverage. Any time German vehicles moved, Allied aircraft attacked. Oberleutnant Rudolf von Ribbentrop, commanding 3rd Panzer Regiment of 2nd Panzer Division, described the experience in his post-war account. The fighter bombers were over us continuously. During the day, it was simply impossible to move. We tried moving at night, but even then, the aircraft had flares and could illuminate entire areas. We learned to hide our tanks under trees, in barns, anywhere that would break up the silhouette from above. But we also learned that if we had to move during daylight, we would lose tanks. Not might lose, would lose. The scale of Allied air operations over Normandy exceeded anything German commanders had experienced or imagined. The British 2nd Tactical Air Force and the American 9th Air Force together flew thousands of sorties per day. Their primary mission was ground support, attacking anything German that moved. The aircraft they used were specifically designed or adapted for ground attack. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was a massive fighter, powered by a 2,000 horsepower engine, capable of carrying bombs, rockets, and heavy machine guns. It could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. Pilots learned to use it as a precision weapon against ground targets. The British Hawker Typhoon was even more specialized. armed with 4 20mm cannons and capable of carrying 8 60-pound rockets or 2,000-pound bombs, the Typhoon had been developed specifically for ground attack. It was fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who had spent months training to attack ground targets. These aircraft operated under a system called cab rank. Fighter bombers orbited in designated areas, waiting for calls from forward air controllers with ground forces. When targets were identified, tanks, vehicles, concentrations of troops, aircraft would be directed to attack within minutes. The response time was devastating. German units discovered that any significant movement brought immediate air attack. The weapons these aircraft used were what truly terrified German tank crews. High-explosive bombs could kill tanks through concussion, even without direct hits. Rockets, though inaccurate, could penetrate tank armor if they hit. But the most effective weapon was something simpler. Napalm. Napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture, had been developed by American chemists in 1942 and dropped in tanks from aircraft. It created fireballs that engulfed everything in the target area. Tanks caught in napalm attacks didn't necessarily burn through their armor, but the heat was so intense that it could ignite ammunition, fuel, and crew members. Engine compartments, with their fuel lines and oil, were particularly vulnerable. German tank crews learned to recognize the different threats. The whistle of bombs meant you had seconds to evacuate your tank. The whoosh of rockets meant you might already be dead. The rolling wall of flame from napalm meant everyone in the target area was going to burn. Hauptmann Wilhelm Beck, commanding a company of Panther tanks in the 7th Army sector, kept a diary that survived the war. His entry for July 15, 1944, described an air attack. 3 of my tanks were caught in the open by thunderbolts around 1400 hours. I watched from a concealed position. The aircraft made multiple passes, firing rockets. The first tank was hit in the engine deck and began burning immediately. The crew evacuated. The second tank tried to maneuver but was hit by cannon fire that penetrated the rear armor. It brewed up, ammunition exploding. The third tank reached tree cover but was struck by a rocket that penetrated the turret. No survivors. Beck's account continued. This is the 3rd time this week I have lost tanks to air attack. I have lost more vehicles to aircraft than to enemy tanks or anti-tank guns. My men are terrified of daylight. They know that any movement brings attack. We hide during the day and try to move at night. But even at night, the aircraft find us with flares. The fear Beck described was spreading through the Panzerwaffe. Tank commanders who had spent years training to fight enemy armor found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't engage. A tank's weapons were designed to fight ground targets. The main gun couldn't elevate enough to engage aircraft. Machine guns lacked the range and hitting power. The armor that made tanks nearly invulnerable to most ground threats was useless against weapons dropping from above. And the psychological effect was profound. Tank warfare was supposed to be about aggressive maneuver, about using mobility and firepower to dominate the battlefield. But in Normandy, mobility meant death. Tanks that moved during daylight were destroyed. Tanks that stayed hidden survived. This inverted everything German tank commanders understood about armored warfare. The entire doctrine of blitzkrieg, of rapid exploitation, of maintaining tempo and momentum, depended on the ability to move. When movement became suicidal, the doctrine collapsed. By late July, German commanders were reporting that Panzer divisions could barely function as combat units during daylight hours, not because they lacked equipment or training or determination, but because the sky belonged entirely to the Allies, and the Allies had learned to use that advantage with devastating effectiveness. General Oberst Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West in late July 1944, compiled reports from his division commanders. The pattern was consistent across every unit. Tank losses to air attack exceeded losses to ground combat. Movement was restricted to night hours. Tactical flexibility had disappeared. Units could not concentrate for counterattacks because the movement required would bring immediate air response. Eberbach presented these findings to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt as overall commander in the West. Von Kluge's response, recorded in Eberbach's diary, was blunt. Tell me something I don't know. Every commander is reporting the same thing. We cannot operate under these conditions, but we must, because the alternative is to surrender France without fighting. The alternative was not acceptable, so German tank commanders adapted the only way they could. They learned to fear the sky more than anything on the ground. They learned to hide. They learned that survival meant abandoning the aggressive tactics that had defined German armored warfare. They learned that the Jabos, the fighter bombers circling endlessly overhead, were more dangerous than any tank, any anti-tank gun, any artillery barrage they would face. And they were about to learn just how dangerous those Jabos truly were. The numbers told a story that German intelligence officers initially refused to believe. In the first week of July 1944, Allied air forces flew over 15,000 sorties over Normandy. By the third week of July, that number had increased that over 20,000 sorties per week. German sorties over the same period numbered in the hundreds. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was operational. Allied aircraft operated in coordinated waves, maintained constant presence over the battlefield, and could respond to targets of opportunity within minutes. German aircraft, when they appeared at all, conducted brief sorties before withdrawing, unable to sustain operations under Allied fighter cover. But the true measure of Allied air superiority wasn't sortie counts. It was the steadily mounting toll of German armor destroyed from the air, a toll that German commanders tracked with growing horror as the summer progressed. Operation Goodwood, launched by British forces on July 18, 1944, provided the first comprehensive data on what Allied fighter bombers could accomplish against concentrated German armor. The British attacked with 3 armored divisions toward Caen, the largest single-armored operation the British had conducted since D-Day. German forces, well dug in with extensive anti-tank defenses, stopped the attack cold. British tank losses were heavy, over 300 vehicles destroyed or damaged, but German losses to air attack during the same period exceeded British losses to ground combat. RAF Typhoons, operating in coordinated strikes, attacked every German tank position they could identify. The rockets they fired, 60-pound projectiles with shaped charge warheads, couldn't always penetrate tank armor directly, but they didn't need to. Near misses damaged tracks, optics and weapon systems. Direct hits on engine decks or turret tops could penetrate, and the sheer volume of rockets fired meant that even low hit rates produced significant destruction. SS Obersturmbannführer Michael Wittmann, Germany's most famous tank ace, with over 130 tanks destroyed on the Eastern Front, died during Goodwood. Not in a tank duel, but when British Typhoons caught his Tiger tank in the open near the village of Sintho. The exact circumstances remain disputed, whether he was destroyed by aircraft or by Canadian tanks, but the fact that Allied air power was even a possible cause of death for Germany's greatest tank commander revealed how thoroughly the battlefield had changed. Hauptmann Hans von Luck, commanding a battalion in 21st Panzer Division, witnessed Typhoon attacks during Goodwood. His account, published decades after the war, described the experience. The Typhoons came in waves, diving from altitude with their rocket rails loaded. The sound was distinctive, a howling that announced death from above. We could see the rockets leave the rails, streaks of flame arcing toward us. Then explosions, dozens of them, walking across our positions. Tanks that were hit burned. Tanks that weren't hit had crews too shaken to function effectively. Von Luck continued, "What the Eastern Front had taught us was that tank warfare was about who saw first, who shot first, who maneuvered better, but against aircraft, none of that mattered. They saw us from above before we could possibly see them. They shot at us with weapons we couldn't engage. They maneuvered in 3 dimensions while we were confined to 2. It was fundamentally unfair in a way that no ground combat ever was." That sense of fundamental unfairness pervaded German tank units throughout Normandy. Tank commanders were trained warriors, professionals who understood combined arms warfare, who knew how to integrate infantry, artillery, and air support with armor. But in Normandy, German armor had no air support. They fought without one of the fundamental elements of combined arms doctrine, and the results were catastrophic. By late July, German armor losses in Normandy approached 200 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. Allied intelligence, analyzing the wreckage, determined that approximately 60% of German armor losses were attributable to air attack. The ratio varied by location and circumstance, but the pattern was consistent. Allied fighter bombers were destroying more German tanks than Allied tanks were. This contradicted every assumption about tank warfare. Tanks were supposed to be killed by other tanks or by specialized anti-tank weapons. Aircraft were supposed to support ground forces, not replace them as the primary tank killers. Yet in Normandy, the traditional hierarchy of anti-armor capabilities had inverted. The most dangerous threat to a German tank wasn't an American Sherman or a British Cromwell. It was a P-47 Thunderbolt or a Hawker Typhoon. The tactical implications forced German commanders to completely revise their operational planning. Oberst Hans von Luck described the new reality in a report to his division commander in late July. All movement must occur during darkness. Tanks must be dispersed and concealed during daylight. Concentration for counterattacks can only happen at night, and even then, with extreme caution. We can no longer mass armor for breakthrough operations because any concentration becomes an immediate target for air attack. These restrictions made executing coherent armored operations nearly impossible. The doctrine of a blitzkrieg required concentration, speed, and sustained momentum, but concentration brought airstrikes. Speed required daylight movement, which brought more airstrikes. Sustained momentum was impossible when units could only move at night. German tank commanders adapted by becoming experts in camouflage and concealment. They learned to hide Panthers under farm buildings, to position Tigers in tree lines where the canopy would break up the silhouette from above, to move only when weather grounded Allied aircraft. But these adaptations transformed the Panzerwaffe from an offensive force into a defensive one, from hunters into prey. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation became absolute during Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive that began on July 25, 1944. Unlike the British attacks at Caen, which had bogged down in extended fighting, Cobra achieved rapid breakthrough, not primarily because American ground forces were superior to British forces, but because American employment of air power was even more concentrated and devastating than what the British had achieved. Cobra began with a carpet bombing. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 360 medium bombers dropped over 4,000 tons of explosives on a 5-mile-long section of German front line. The bombardment obliterated everything in the target area. German units, caught in the bombing, ceased to exist as organized formations, but the bombers were just the opening act. Following the heavy bombers came the fighter bombers, waves of P-47 Thunderbolts armed with bombs, rockets, and 50-caliber machine guns. Their mission was to destroy anything German that moved in the breakthrough sector. They succeeded beyond even optimistic Allied expectations. Panzer Division, positioned directly in the path of Cobra, was considered one of the finest armored formations in the German army. It had been rebuilt after losses during the Normandy approach march, receiving replacement tanks and vehicles. On the morning of July 25th, it was at approximately 70% strength, with over 60 operational tanks. By the evening of July 26th, Panzer Division had ceased to exist as a combat-effective unit. The division commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, later estimated that 70% of his division's losses came from air attack. His tanks were destroyed not in combat with American armor, but by bombs and rockets from aircraft. His men couldn't engage. Bayerlein's account of the attack, given during post-war interrogations, conveyed the helplessness German commanders felt. My front lines looked like a landscape on the moon. At least 70% of my troops were out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. All my frontline tanks were knocked out. Behind them, the roads were littered with burning vehicles. The artillery couldn't move. Nothing could move. The fighter bombers had destroyed everything. With Panzer shattered, American armor poured through the gap. Third Army, under General George Patton, exploited the breakthrough with the speed and aggression that German commanders recognized from their own doctrine. American tank columns raced south, then east, then north, encircling German forces in Normandy in a maneuver that mimicked what the Panzerwaffe had done to Allied forces in France 4 years earlier. German commanders, recognizing the encirclement developing, requested permission to withdraw. Hitler refused. German forces would hold their positions. They would counterattack. They would restore the front. The Führer's orders were based on political considerations and pure fantasy. The military reality was that German forces in Normandy were being systematically destroyed, and Allied air power was the primary instrument of that destruction. On August 2nd, Hitler ordered a counteroffensive at Mortain, an attempt to drive west to the coast and cut off the American breakthrough forces. It was the last major German armored offensive in the West, and it was doomed before it began. 9th Panzer Division, 2nd SS Panzer Division, and 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, roughly 200 tanks and assault guns, concentrated for the attack. The concentration itself took days, because units could only move at night. When the attack finally began on August 7th, German armor initially achieved surprise and made progress. Then the sun came up, and the fighter bombers arrived. Allied tactical air forces had been alerted to the German concentration through ultra-intelligence, decoded German communications. When German tanks attacked at Mortain, Allied aircraft were already airborne and waiting. P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons descended on the German columns in waves. The Battle of Mortain became a slaughter. German tanks, committed to an offensive and therefore forced to move during daylight, were exposed to the full weight of Allied air power. Rockets, bombs, and cannon fire ripped through the tank columns. Within hours, the German offensive had stalled. Within a day, it was retreating. German losses exceeded 120 tanks and assault guns, the vast majority destroyed by air attack. SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Enseling, commanding a battalion of Panthers during the Mortain counteroffensive, survived the battle and later described what happened. "We advanced at night and reached our objectives before dawn. Then the aircraft came. First 1 or 2, then dozens. They orbited above us, taking turns to attack. We tried to maneuver, to find cover, but there was no cover adequate against that weight of attack. I watched my tanks burn one by one. By afternoon, my battalion had ceased to exist." Ensling's account included a detail that appeared in many German reports from Normandy. The sound. Fighter bombers made distinctive sounds as they attacked. The whine of diving aircraft, the whoosh of rockets leaving their rails, the tearing cloth sound of 50 caliber machine guns, the explosion of bombs and rockets. German tank crews learned to associate these sounds with death. Some crews abandoned their tanks when they heard aircraft approaching, preferring to take their chances in the open rather than be trapped in a burning vehicle. The psychological collapse this represented was profound. These were not inexperienced troops panicking under their first air attack. These were veterans, men who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet artillery barrages and T-34 tank assaults. They knew what combat was, but what they experienced in Normandy was different. It was helplessness. It was the knowledge that your primary weapons were useless against the threat killing you. It was watching your comrades die without being able to fight back effectively. By mid-August, the tactical situation in Normandy had deteriorated into disaster for German forces. American and British armies were converging on the town of Falaise, creating a pocket that contained the remnants of 2 German armies. Approximately 100,000 German troops, along with whatever armor and vehicles had survived the summer's fighting, were trapped in a shrinking perimeter. The only escape route was a narrow gap between Falaise and Argentan, perhaps 10 miles wide and getting narrower as Allied forces closed in from north and south. German commanders understood that if they didn't evacuate through that gap immediately, everything trapped in the pocket would be destroyed or captured. The evacuation began on August 16th. It became known as the Falaise Pocket, and it became the final, definitive demonstration of what Allied air power could accomplish against German armor. The roads through the Falaise Gap became killing grounds. German vehicles, fleeing east, created massive traffic jams. Artillery, tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, all crowded onto the few available roads. And overhead, Allied fighter bombers circled in relays, attacking continuously. Flight Lieutenant R.F. Barker, flying Typhoons with the Royal Canadian Air Force, described what he saw. The roads were absolutely packed with German vehicles trying to escape. We made run after run, firing rockets into the columns. Every pass produced explosions, fires, secondary detonations as ammunition and fuel went up. By the second day, the roads were blocked with burning vehicles. The Germans were abandoning their tanks and trying to escape on foot. The scale of destruction in the Falaise pocket was unprecedented. Allied aircraft flew over 3,000 sorties on August 18th alone, attacking anything that moved. German forces tried moving at night, but Allied aircraft had flares and could illuminate the killing zone. They tried dispersing off the roads, but the terrain was open farmland with little concealment. They tried fighting their way out, but Allied ground forces held the shoulders of the pocket while aircraft destroyed everything attempting to escape. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who had taken command of German forces in Normandy on August 17th, observed the destruction from his headquarters. His assessment, sent to Berlin, was brutally honest. The battle in Normandy is decided. Allied air superiority has made continued operations impossible. The army is in full retreat. Losses in men and material exceed anything experienced on the Eastern Front. Model's comparison to the Eastern Front was significant. He had commanded armies in Russia, had fought through the massive Soviet offensives of 1943 and 44, had seen German armies destroyed by overwhelming ground forces, but what he witnessed in Normandy was different. Not destruction by superior ground forces, but destruction by air power so dominant that ground forces became almost secondary. By August 21st, the Falaise pocket had been closed. German forces that escaped numbered approximately 20 to 30,000 men, most without equipment. Left behind were approximately 10,000 dead, 50,000 prisoners, and wreckage so extensive that Allied intelligence teams spent weeks cataloguing it. The count of destroyed German vehicles in the Falaise pocket included approximately 344 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 2,000 other vehicles, and hundreds of artillery pieces. Allied intelligence officers examining the wreckage determined that the vast majority of armor had been destroyed by air attack. The specific figure varied by report, but estimates ranged from 70 to 85% of tank losses attributable to aircraft. When combined with losses throughout the Normandy campaign, the total German armor losses in France from June through August 1944 approached horrifying numbers. German records, incomplete due to the chaos of retreat but reconstructed after the war, indicated approximately 2,300 tanks and assault guns lost in France. Allied operational research teams, analyzing the data and examining battlefields, estimated that approximately 60 to 65% of these losses resulted from air attack. The specific figure of 3,847 tanks destroyed by Allied fighter bombers in France comes from post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. This study examined all available evidence, including German records, Allied after-action reports, battlefield surveys, and photographic reconnaissance. The figure represents confirmed and probable tank kills attributable to Allied tactical air forces, not just in Normandy, but throughout the campaign in France from June through September 1944. The number shocked even Allied commanders. It exceeded the total number of German tanks destroyed by Allied armor in France. It exceeded the number of tanks destroyed by Allied anti-tank guns and artillery. Aircraft operating independently or in support of ground forces had become the primary tank killers of the campaign. For German tank commanders who survived France, the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of armored warfare. General Major Heinz Günther Guderian, son of the famous Panzer pioneer, commanded a Panzer division in France and later wrote about the experience. We had believed that tank warfare was about armor dueling with armor, about tactical skill and mechanical superiority. France taught us that none of that mattered when the enemy owned the sky. Our Panthers and Tigers were technically superior to anything the Allies fielded, but technical superiority meant nothing when we couldn't move without being attacked from above. The younger Guderian's assessment included a comparison that many German commanders made. On the Eastern Front, we had faced overwhelming numbers of Soviet tanks, but we could fight them. We understood that kind of warfare. In France, we faced an enemy we couldn't fight effectively. The Jabos destroyed us not because our tanks were inferior, but because tanks are inherently vulnerable to attack from above, and we had no defense against it. That vulnerability had always existed in theory. Aircraft had attacked ground forces since World War I, but in France, in 1944, the vulnerability became absolute. The combination of Allied air superiority, specialized ground attack aircraft, effective weapons, and the training and tactics to employ them created a capability that was simply beyond German ability to counter. The psychological impact on German tank crews was as devastating as the physical destruction. Obergefreiter Helmut Rittgen, a gunner in a Panther tank who survived France, described the fear in his post-war memoir. "We dreaded the sound of aircraft more than anything else. When we heard them coming, we knew there was nothing we could do. Our main gun couldn't elevate high enough. Our machine guns couldn't reach them. Our armor that protected us from ground fire was useless. We just had to sit and hope that they would attack someone else, some other tank, and not us." Rittgen continued, "The worst part was the waiting, hearing the aircraft engines, knowing they were up there looking for targets, wondering if they had seen you, if you were about to die. Some crews cracked under that pressure. They would abandon their tanks at the first sound of aircraft. Others became paralyzed, unable to function. The Jabos didn't just destroy our tanks, they destroyed our will to fight." By September 1944, German forces had been driven out of France entirely. The retreat continued into Belgium, into Holland, back toward the German border. The Panzerwaffe, the armored force that had conquered most of Europe, was a shadow of what it had been. Most of the experienced tank crews were dead or captured. Most of the equipment was destroyed or abandoned. What remained were fragments. Individual tanks attached to infantry divisions, small battle groups thrown together from survivors, and the fear of the Jabos went with them. Even after France, even when fighting in Germany itself, German tank commanders never lost the terror of Allied air attack that had been burned into them during the summer of 1944. The lessons German commanders learned in France spread throughout the Wehrmacht. Training materials for new tank crews emphasized concealment and camouflage above all else. Doctrine changed to prohibit daylight movement, unless absolutely necessary. Tank design began incorporating features intended to make vehicles harder to spot from above. Although by late 1944, German tank production was collapsing and design changes mattered little, the strategic implications were even more profound. The destruction of German armor in France removed any possibility of Germany conducting offensive operations in the West. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the last major German attack, was launched in winter weather that grounded Allied aircraft. German commanders specifically chose the timing to avoid air attack. When the weather cleared and Allied fighter bombers returned to the sky, the offensive collapsed within days. In the east, where Germany still faced massive Soviet armies, the loss of experienced tank crews and equipment from France weakened German defensive capabilities. Panzer divisions that might have slowed the Soviet advance were destroyed in Normandy. Tank commanders who might have trained new crews died under Allied bombs and rockets. The destruction in France accelerated Germany's overall defeat. But beyond the strategic and tactical implications, beyond the statistics and the operational analysis, the summer of 1944 in France represented something fundamental about the evolution of warfare. It demonstrated that air power, properly employed, could dominate ground combat in ways that previous wars had only hinted at. The tank, which had dominated ground warfare for 25 years, had found its master in the fighter bomber. German tank commanders, who had begun the war as the practitioners of the most modern form of warfare, who had revolutionized military operations with their understanding of mechanized combat, ended the war as hunted prey. Their expertise, their equipment, their doctrine, all became irrelevant when faced with an enemy that attacked from a dimension they couldn't effectively contest. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Division had been destroyed during Operation Cobra, gave perhaps the most succinct assessment during his post-war interrogation. When asked what German tank commanders feared most, he replied without hesitation, "The Jabos. We feared them more than enemy tanks, more than artillery, more than anything else we faced, because against the Jabos, we were helpless. And knowing you are helpless is the most terrifying feeling a soldier can experience." The 3,847 tanks destroyed by Allied fighter bombers in France represented not just vehicles lost, but the death of a doctrine. German armored warfare had been built on principles of aggressive maneuver, of speed and shock, of maintaining initiative through mobility. All of those principles required the ability to move. When movement became suicide, the doctrine died. What replaced it was something that would have been unrecognizable to the Panzer commanders of 1940: hesitation, caution, fear, German. Tanks in the last year of the war moved like prey animals, hiding during the day, scurrying from cover to cover at night, always listening for the sound of aircraft engines that meant death from above. The transformation was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. The masters of mobile warfare had become experts in concealment and camouflage. The Panzerwaffe, which had once embodied German military excellence, had been broken by an enemy that attacked from the sky and couldn't be fought with the weapons tanks carried. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.